Hi everyone, I'm Gertie, and thank you so much for buying my book, Gertie's Charmed Sewing Studio. Today, we're gonna be showing you how to sew the Madeleine dress. So I knew when I wrote this book that I would have to include a pattern that was inspired by Dior's 1947 New Look. And when you read the introduction to this pattern in the book, you'll really get the historical context for it, and also why I named this pattern after Dior's mother, Madeleine. This dress has a sweetheart neckline, princess seams, cap sleeves, and it has a really full dramatic skirt, which is achieved with gores set into box pleats. And what I love about this is it's a really fun opportunity to play around with contrast fabrics. Below, you'll find a list of timestamps for this video so you can jump around to whatever part you need. And you'll also find links to the other videos for the two other patterns in the book, which are the Camille sheath, which I am wearing today, as well as the Lillian jacket. You'll also find where you can join our Patreon, which is where we release a new vintage-inspired pattern every single month, as well as a video tutorial just like this one to help you sew that pattern start to finish. So when you join, you will have access to the entire past library of patterns and videos, as well as you'll be joining an amazing community of like-minded sewists of all skill levels. So let's get started with the Madeleine dress. We're going to start with talking about the pattern pieces, and you'll see how they get sewn together. And then we'll move on to fabric and supplies. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the pattern pieces. So as we always do, we have minimized the pattern pieces down to 25% so that you can see them all together and understand how the dress gets sewn together. Okay, so at its heart, this is a princess seamed dress. So you have 4 panels for the dress, and you're gonna cut 2 of each. And you have 2 panels for the front and 2 panels for the back. Now, what is unusual about this dress pattern is that you can see there's this sort of square shape at the waistline on each of these panels. And that is for the box pleats that form the gores. So what's going to happen is you can see that there is a marked line here, which is important to transfer to your fabric, with a circle at the top. And starting at the circle, what you're going to be doing is folding along that line to the wrong side of the dress and pressing. And then when these panels get sewn together, that will form a box pleat. And you're going to take your gore and sew it to the back of that box pleat. So what's going to happen is each gore will get sewn to each of these princess panels along these long edges from that squared corner down, okay? So that's how it comes together. Like I said, 2 fabric of each of these pieces. It's important to note that the center front is not cut on the fold like it normally may be. There's a seam of the center front. Okay, so then you need to note that you have some circles to transfer. So neckline circles are really important, and those gore circles. And then you're gonna wanna snip into any of those notches as well. Okay, so beyond the basic dress pieces, we also have the gore, which you need to cut 6 of this because there are 6 gores. So you can cut that in your main fabric, or you can use a contrast fabric for your gores. Next, we have a short sleeve. Okay, so we're gonna cut 2 fabric on that. And then finally, you have your neckline facing pieces. This dress is unlined, so the facings are what finish that neckline edge. So let's look at the back facing first. You're gonna cut 2 fabric and 2 interfacing on this. And you can see that this echoes the neckline on the back, right? With the front neck facing, it's the same thing, 2 fabric, 2 interfacing. And once these panels are sewn together, this neckline facing will fit perfectly around the front neckline. Okay, so that's it. It's pretty simple as far as pattern pieces go. There aren't a ton of them, but just a few things to note. Okay, so next we're gonna talk about your fabric and supplies. All right, so now I'm going to talk you through the fabric recommendations and supplies needed to sew the Madeleine dress. So as you'll see in the book, the recommended fabrics are light to medium weight wovens with some body. So that means that anything with drape is not going to be a good fit. Think about rayon challis or crepe de chine. Not a good fit for this dress because you really want a crisp look, okay? And then also you're looking for woven fabrics, not knits. So you can see all of the recommendations in the book, but here I'm just going to take you through some of my favorite choices for the Madeleine dress. So the cover look we sewed in Dupioni, which is a silk fabric that has these lovely slubs on it. And it's usually woven with 2 different threads in 2 different colors. So one color going this direction, another color going the other direction, which gives it that iridescent look. Okay, so this would be a lovely choice. This is a silk with some body. Another silk with body would be silk taffeta. And of course, you can get a synthetic taffeta as well if you like. So this would be really lovely, a lot of crispness to this silk. Now, if you want to go a little fancier, a little exciting, you could do a brocade or a matelassé like this one that has the texture on it. So that might be nice for an evening or cocktail look. And then finally, let's talk about contrast ideas. So you could either sew the dress in a solid, right? So something like this cotton sateen would be a great choice. This is a stretch sateen, so it just has a little bit of lycra woven into the cotton. This would be a great choice for the dress. And then here's a wild idea. You could do this rainbow seersucker for the gores. Another idea is that you could do the dress itself in the print. Like, I love this rose print. This was one of my fabric designs from years ago. It's a stretch sateen. This could be the main dress, and then you could do the gores in a contrasting solid or a coordinating solid. Okay, this is a satin, so that would give it a little bit of a sheen, but you could also just use a cotton sateen in a coordinating color as well. Okay, so there's a few ideas, but this dress can really go from casual with a cotton broadcloth all the way up to a fancy silk. Now, you're also going to need a 24-inch zipper for your dress, and keep in mind it needs to be a regular zipper, not an invisible zipper. You will need thread to match your fabric. You'll need machine sewing needles to match the weight of your fabric. My favorite needle for wovens is a Microtex, but a universal needle is fine as well. And for most of these fabrics, a 70-10 or an 80-12 size would work great. And then you're going to need some interfacing for your facing pieces. We recommend woven interfacing, tricot, or weft are all good fusible interfacing choices. You do want to avoid non-woven interfacings like a heavy craft, papery feeling interfacing. You will also need to stabilize your zipper opening with strips of interfacing. Now, here in the studio, we love this 1.25 inch wide fusible stay tape, it's called, but it's essentially just cut strips of interfacing on a roll. It's fusible interfacing, okay? So you can buy this, or you can just cut strips of your fusible interfacing to the length of your zipper. You'll need 2 of them. You will need some grosgrain or Petersham ribbon for your waiststay. Now, you can get this ribbon in natural fibers like cotton or rayon, which feels really nice against the body. It also comes in polyester, which can be a little more uncomfortable, but no big deal if that's all you can get. You'll want it to be 1 inch wide, and then your waist measurement plus 1.5 inches. And then finally, you're going to need hooks and eyes, 2 sets of hooks and eyes for your waiststay. And that is all for your fabrics and supplies. Let's get sewing. Okay, so we've already done steps 1 and 2 in the instructions. So that means you have stay stitched your center front panel neckline, as well as that front princess seam and pivoted at that corner right there. So stay stitching is at 1/2 inch. You also will have done step 2, but don't worry, you have a chance to look at that a little bit later. Right now, we're going to move on to step 3. And this is something that we're going to do on all of these panels with the little corner inset feature there. So we need to turn in the panel along the fold line. So from the circle down to the hem. And that line is 2 1/8 inches in from the raw edge. And you can see we've already serged our edges. So that's something you can do, is to finish those edges in advance. But what we're doing here is we are turning in those edges 2 1/8 inches, And you really want to be precise with this. So measure as you go and then press in. And the area you want to press is from the circle down. Don't press above the circle. And just continue like that all the way down to the hem of the dress. Okay, so once you're finished with that on the center front panel, you can put it to the side, and now we will look at the side front panel, and it's the same thing. From the circle mark down, from that corner, you are going to turn in 2 1/8 inches and press. And again, just make sure that you're checking as you go. This is a great task for one of these clear gridded rulers, or a seam gauge is another nice thing to have on hand. And there we have it. Our pleats are pressed and we can move on. All right, so now we're ready to move on to step 4, which is to sew your dress center front seam. So you're gonna take your 2 center front panels and you're gonna pin them together from the circle mark down. And what I didn't say at the end of the last scene is that you would have repeated those steps for the other 2 panels on the front of the dress, right? So you would have pressed in your pleats for both center front panels and both side front panels. And now we're taking the 2 center front panels and pinning them together along the side that does not have the pleat folded in. So this is the very center front of that sweetheart neckline down to the hem. Okay, so now you can see it fully pinned, those center front panels, right sides together. And now, very important, we're gonna start stitching right on the circle mark, okay? You don't wanna stitch above it at all. So stitch and then back stitch, and you're stitching at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you're using about a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. And just stitch all the way down from the circle mark to the hem. And the reason for not stitching above the circle mark is that that is a really important pivot point when we sew the neckline to create that beautiful sweetheart shape. Okay, so now you can open those 2 panels up and press your seam allowances open. So just use your fingers to get in between the seam allowances, and then the tip of your iron and a little bit of steam if your fabric likes steam. And then go to the neckline, and you can see how the seam is open above that circle. So just leave it that way. And that is it. You can see our stay stitching here, and now we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're all set to do step 5, which is to sew our front princess seams. Now, this is a really standard princess seam, except for the fact that we're going to leave it open below that circle at the waistline so that we can put the gores in later. So it's a little unusual, but everything we're doing about sewing this princess seam is standard for a princess seam. So what Andrea just did was she made little clips on the center front panel where we stay stitched. And we're going to sew the center front to the side front panel, which she's already done on one side, and now we're going to do on the opposite side. So we're going to put right sides together, the center front panel to the side front panel, and you're going to match your circle mark at the top of the pleat where you pressed it in 2 1/8 inches. And then you're going to make sure that you have your notch marks. You can mark them in with a disappearing ink marker or something, and then go and pin at the notch. And then go to the neckline and match the neckline. Now keep in mind that there will be a little triangle sort of poking out at the top of the seam allowance, but your seam lines, the 5/8 of an inch, should match exactly at the neckline. And now we're pinning these curves together. So what's going to happen is you're going to need to spread your clips on the the center front panel. You're going to need to spread them to match the curve of the side front. And normally you would sew from the side with the clips on it, but in this case, we need to sew from the neckline down. So you're going to sew with the side front on top, or the unclipped side. So use a lot of pins just to make sure that your clips stay spread open, because you won't be able to keep an eye on them. And now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch from the neckline and back stitch, and you're stitch all the way from the neckline, the very top edge, down to the waistline circle mark. And here is a little weird because you are not going to be able to see your throat plate. So you're probably using the marks on your machine here at 5/8 of an inch to guide your seam allowance. You're going to lose that once you get beyond the top of that little pleat section. So just make sure that you're following your marks at the top as you're feeding it through the machine. And then once you lose it, like right about here, you're just going to continue stitching straight to your circle mark. So you're going to stitch all the way up to your circle mark directly on it and then back stitch. So be careful of your pins here. See, Andrea stitched right up to her pin, but not over it. And then that's it. We leave it open at those pressed in sections below the circle mark. And now we will press our seam allowances as one to center front. But first you can do a little notching on the side front panel, the curvier panel. So just cut little triangles out, and that will help these seams press nicely. And then you're also going to want to do a diagonal clip to the circle mark from the seam allowance directly to the circle mark, but not through your stitching. And that will help you press the seam allowances to one side, whereas below the waist, we're going to press them open. Okay, so pressing those seam allowances as one to center front. If you like, you can also serge them together at this point and trim off just a little bit of the seam allowance so you don't have quite so much and you don't have two long seam allowances right on top of each other. So you could trim them down to about 3/8 of an inch if you like. And there we go. We have 2 sewn front princess seam, and our dress front is almost completed. Okay, so if you're following along in your book, and hopefully you are, this is step 6 now. And it's really the same as for the front. So if you feel comfortable with those princess seams, you can move on. But we're going to show you sewing the princess seams one more time, since it is a little unusual with this dress. And I do want to note that you can see on the center back panel that the center back is stabilized with 1.25 inch wide stay tape down to the zipper circle. That was step 2. Okay, so now we are looking at the center back panel and the side back panel. And you can see that the side back is pretty curvy, a little curvier than most side back panels are, which helps build into the shape of this dress. And we've stay stitched the center back panel, just like we did for the center front, from the underarm down to the pleat circle. And now what we're doing is we're just clipping about every 1/2 inch. And these are the clips that are going to be spread when we go to pin this to the curve of the side back panel. Okay, so now we're putting these 2 pieces right sides together. And we've got a few match points, right? So best practice is to always pin your match points first and then fill in pins in between. So we've got our circle mark at the waistline, and you want to make sure that you're matching it top to bottom. You've got a notch mark. So you either just snipped into that with scissors, or maybe you marked it with a disappearing ink marker, which is a great idea. You're going to match those 2 notches. And then you're going to go to the upper edge, which is actually the armhole here. So on the front of the dress, the princess seam goes up to the neckline. On the back of the dress, it goes to the back armhole. So just something to note there. And you're pinning at the neckline. Okay, so we've got those 3 match points pinned, and now we're going to fill in pins in between, and you're going to spread out the side front panel clips. I'm sorry, the side back panel clips, but it's the same process as for the front princess seam. And once you've got plenty of pins, then we're going to stitch this at 5/8 of an inch. And starting exactly at the upper armhole point, you are going to start backstitch and then stitch to your lower circle mark at the waistline. And now if you remember what we did on the front panel, it's the same thing. We're going to do a little bit of clipping and notching. So on the curvier side, the side back panel, you can do a few little notches. That will help your seam allowances lay flatter. And then you're going to clip into the waistline point. Don't forget this step, very important, so that the princess seams can be pressed to one side, and then below that circle mark, you can press those pleats open. Now, again, I just want to reiterate that above the circle mark with the princess seam, you could definitely go to your serger, and this was probably what I would do, honestly, is go to my serger and then trim those down together at 3/8 of an inch. You don't have to, but I always like princess seams when they're pressed to one side to be finished together. So consider that, but again, you don't have to, but the important thing is they're pressed together towards center back. You're going to finish your other back princess seam, and then we are ready to move on. Okay, so now we are getting ready for step 7, which is putting the dress back together with the dress front, or the 2 dress backs. So we're going to be stitching them at the shoulder seams and the side seams. And everything looks a little funny right now in the studio. We call this the octopus stage of this dress because you have all these flaps still open below the waist where we are going to be putting in those gores. So it's a little tentacle-like at this point, but you just want to focus above the waist here. So you're going to be putting each back unit together with the front unit, right sides together, and you're going to pin first at the waistline. Now there are gores on the side seams, right? So these are going to stay pressed open. And on your side panels, hopefully this was clear earlier, but they're going to have a gore on both sides of both the side front panel and the side back panel, not just one side. Okay, and now we are pinning together the shoulder seams. Just that short little shoulder seam there. And now we're going to sew the shoulder seams at 5/8 of an inch. And then you're going to sew the side seams from the underarm down to the waistline circle mark. You can see it marked in there. You're going to stitch exactly to the circle mark and then back stitch. And now we can press the side seams open. You don't have to clip into the circle because you're pressing the seam allowances open. And same with the shoulder seams. And then you would repeat this on the other side of the dress. And then we're going to move on to step 8. Okay, so you've completed your bodice and now we are ready to insert the gores into the skirt. Now this sewing is fairly straightforward and easy, but do keep in mind it may feel a little weird because as you're sewing in the gores, there's nothing controlling them at the waistline and they're kind of flopping around inside the dress. So you may feel like you're doing something wrong, but I promise you at the end, we're going to do this really lovely vintage finish with a waiststay, which will give you a nice finish on the inside of the dress as well as control those gores at the waistline. Okay, so what we're talking about here is actually steps 8 and 9. And this is putting the gores into these open pleat sections below the waist. So I think this part is really fun and satisfying, especially if you're using a contrast fabric like this polka dot fabric that we're using for our gores. And you can see that Andrea's already sewn one of them. They're sewn along the long edges and then they're open at the top, okay? So don't worry about that. Like I said, we're gonna be finishing that open section when we apply the waist tape. So we're just gonna focus on one gore at a time. You're gonna isolate. We're working on a side seam right now, but this needs to happen on every tentacle, every below the waist circle section. So we are pinning the gore right sides together with the dress, with the pleat that you folded back in the first chapter of this video, from top to bottom. Make sure that you're matching notches and then repeat that on the other side of the gore to the opposing side of the pleat opening. So matching at the top, matching at the bottom, and then filling in pins in between. Again, always doing that best practice of pinning your match points first and then filling in your pins in between there so that everything is distributed evenly. Okay, so now we're going to stitch each side along those seams. So you should always be stitching from the waistline down. So whether the gore or the dress panel is on top will depend on which side of it you're stitching. Okay, so you don't need to really press anything here because we already pressed the pleats in that earlier step. And you can see 2 are sewn here. You're just gonna carry on like that, sewing a gore into each of those open panels. And so the only section where you're not applying a gore is the center back. And just keep in mind that your center back seam will be totally open right now. And so get all those gores in there and then we'll be ready to move on. Okay, so this is step 10. We're sewing that center back seam from the zipper circle down. So above the zipper circle, you've got your seam allowances stabilized with interfacing. So those can be 1.25 inches wide. And then below, we're going to pin from the circle down to the hem. And then next, we're going to stitch this seam. So you're starting right at the zipper circle and back stitching at 5/8 of an inch down to the hem and back stitching again. And now we're going to press this seam allowance open, just up to the zipper circle. And next we're ready to move on. We have a constructed dress here, so we're going to move on to the neckline facings next. Okay, so this is step 11 as you're following along in the book. You're going to grab your 2 front neckline facings. They should both be interfaced, and you want to have finished the lower edge. You can see that we've serged ours. And you're going to pin them together, and this is just like the front neckline of the dress. You are going to only pin and sew from that circle mark down. And again, this is our sweetheart neckline, so you want to be really careful and deliberate to create that beautiful point. So stitching these 2 together, starting exactly at the circle, and then stitching to the bottom of that short little seam, the lower edge. Trim your threads, and now we're going to press this open. So that is your front neckline facing unit, and next you're going to grab your back facing pieces. Okay, so we're moving on to step 12, and this is to sew our front neckline facings to our back neckline facings at the shoulder seams. So looking at these back neckline pieces, you can see one side is angled and the other is straight. Now, the straight side is your center back, and the angled side is your shoulder seam. So make sure you're matching these up correctly. You're going to put it right sides together with the front neckline facing and pin. Same thing at both shoulder seams. Now, because of the sharp angles of these pieces, you will see a little sliver sort of hanging off the side there. That's totally fine as long as it matches up at the 5/8 of an inch seam line. Okay, so we're stitching these at 5/8 of an inch on both shoulder seams, and then we will press them. So you're going to press these open. So you can use a little steam and the tip of your iron to get between the seam allowances and press them nice and flat. And there is your completed neckline facing unit. Okay, so now we are ready to sew our neckline facing to our dress. And we're gonna show you a charm signature technique that we call a clean finish neckline. Now, we love lap zippers at Charm because they have such a vintage look. But sometimes you can get a little bit of a messy finish at the neckline of your dress on the inside with a lap zipper. So we have devised this method. I've been teaching it for many, many years that will give you a beautiful, clean finish on the inside of your dress, and it's going to look so professional. You just have to remember a few measurements, but we're gonna talk you through the entire thing. So let's get started with that clean finish neckline. Okay, so we're looking at the dress front and our facing unit. And we're going to put them right sides together and start at that center front neckline point. Now, at Charm, we always call this a butterfly point or a butterfly seam because when you look at it from the top, it's like 4 little butterfly wings. And it requires a special technique because you're going to have to sew just to the circle right there. And then you're gonna have to move the seam allowances out of the way, stop your stitching, and then restart on the other side of the seam allowances. So we'll walk you through that once we get to that point in the stitching. And now you're gonna continue pinning those edges together. And you'll see at the front princess seam, there is a little bit of overhang of the seam allowance. So don't worry about that. Just pin your match points here. Here's your shoulder seam. Make sure that those stay pressed open. And now we're going to start talking about this clean finish neckline. So we're looking at the right back of the dress right now as you look at it. And you're going to take both seam allowances. So first we're doing the facing seam allowance and turning it up and towards you 1/2 inch. And same thing with the dress seam allowance. So they are both turned in 1/2 inch and they're folded inside each other. So I always say they're nested together. So that's the right side of the dress. It's just 1/2 inch for both seam allowances. The left side is a little different, but we will talk about that when we get there. You're going to continue filling in pins around the neckline. And at the center front point, make sure you're really matching your circles and leaving the seam allowances free there. Okay, so now at the center back on the left side, you're going to turn the facing in 7/8 of an inch and the dress itself in 5/8 of an inch. So those are different measurements and there is a 1/4 inch gap between the two, but they are both turned towards you. Okay, so same as for the other side. So that's 7/8 for the facing and 5/8 of an inch for the dress. And then just continue filling in pins and then we'll be ready to stitch this neckline. So you're starting at the right back, right on top of the fold and back stitching to the very edge of the fold and stitching around the neckline, don't sew over your pins, as you get to the center front circle. You're going to want to be careful because you want to move those seam allowances. This is our butterfly point. Move the seam allowances out of the way, really follow the curve, okay? Because you want to maintain that beautiful curve around the neckline. And so make sure you're exactly at 5/8 and following the curve. And then keep your pin in as long as you can. And when you get to the center front, you're going to stop exactly on the circle mark and then backstitch. And then you're going to break your stitching. So you can pull the dress out of the machine, trim your threads. Now we're going to start on the other side of the butterfly point. So move your seam allowances to the opposite side so that you're able to access the circle on the opposite side of the seam allowances. And put your needle down exactly on the circle mark and then put your presser foot down. And same thing, you're going to start stitching, backstitch, and then just continue on. So your seam allowances will be free at center front. And now you're just going to finish your stitching at the back fold at the left side of the neckline. Okay, so we're stitched on here, and the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna do some grading. So you may already know this, but grading means that you're going to trim the seam allowances to different widths so that they're not the same width right on top of each other, which might create a sort of bulky ridge. You're going to trim the facing down to about 1/4 inch or a little bit less is fine. And first you need to trim diagonally across those center back folds. And now just isolate the facing seam allowance and trim it down. And you'll want to use sharp, small scissors for this, down to about 1/4 inch, or a little bit less is totally fine too, anywhere between 1/8 or 1/4. But the thing to note is this is the narrower seam allowance. And the dress is almost always, or the garment is almost always the wider seam allowance. And you can see because we have those butterfly seams at center front, we're just trimming those down as well. Okay, so now moving on to the dress seam allowance. This one is slightly wider, so it can be about 1/8 of an inch wider than the facing seam allowance. And repeat this same thing on the other side of the butterfly point. And now you can turn the center back points right side out. That's our clean finish in action there. We're going to have a beautiful lap zipper application at center back. And now we need to understitch. So that means that you're going to be holding the facing out from the dress and making sure that the seam allowances are underneath your stitching, and you're stitching just 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line on the facing. So if you've never done understitching before, I highly recommend that you check out our video on YouTube that is just about understitching, that will explain it in depth. Now, you'll note that Andrea stopped at the center front point and broke her stitching again. That is definitely best practice for that center front point, that you did all that work to get a beautiful butterfly point on. So make sure that you stop on either side of that point and don't stitch down those seam allowances. And continue to the opposite side. You have to stop a little bit short of those clean finish seam allowances at center back. And now we're ready to press the facing to the inside of the dress. It can be really helpful, especially on this very curvy neckline, to use a raised surface and to have a curved surface as well, like this ham. So you can grab your tailor's ham and then just use your fingers to press the facing, just rolling it to the outside edge of the dress, especially at center front. Just be really careful and take your time with this because you want to create that beautiful front sweetheart point. Okay, so you can see that we have this beautiful sweetheart point, and by taking our time with the butterfly stitching and really stitching exactly to the circle on either side and leaving the seam allowances free, you have a nice point there. And also, you shouldn't have any gaps or a hole at the neckline. If you do, you can always go back and fix it by hand or correct your stitching. Okay, so we're moving on to sleeves, and this is step 14 in the book instructions. So we're just going to be stitching the underarm seams. So what we're doing here is folding the sleeves right sides together, and we're going to pin that underarm seam. And what we're looking at here is you want to make sure that you're not accidentally sewing two of the same sleeve, especially if your fabric looks the same on the right and wrong side, is lay them out like this so that they are opposing each other, and then make sure that your single notch is on the top for both of them, or the double notch, it doesn't really matter which, but that you have two mirrored sleeves. Okay, so we're pinning at the underarm and stitching just this little portion here at 5/8 of an inch and back stitching on each end. And you can see we already have done some serging at the underarm and on the hem. You don't need to serge around the sleeve cap because we are going to finish those seam allowances as one after we set in the sleeve. So there it is, your underarm seam. Okay, so this is step 15, which is setting the sleeves into the dress. Now, before this step, you'll want to have sewn 2 rows of easing stitches around the cap of the sleeve between the sets of notches, which is standard for any sleeve you're setting in. Use a long stitch length and do 1 at 1/4 inch and 1 at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to start matching up points from the sleeve to the dress. So the double notches mean that it's the back of the sleeve, and there are double notches on the dress to match. And you're going to start by matching the underarm seam once you've confirmed you've got the right sleeve for the right armhole. So start at the underarm and make sure that your seam allowances stay pressed open. You can put a pin on either side of the seam allowances. And then go to your next match point, which is a set of notches, and then pin in between. So you're going to pin your double notch next. And so then you'll have pinned the underarm between the sets of notches, and the cap, or the curvy part of the sleeve, will be free. So now we're going to match the single notch at the top of the cap to the shoulder seam on the dress and put a pin there. Again, your seam allowances on the shoulder stay open. And this is where your easing stitches are. So you're gonna need to pull those up on the dress. There is a little ease built into this sleeve cap, as there are on almost all sleeve caps in a pattern, to give you that range of movement on the armhole. So you're gonna pull them up just slightly, but you don't wanna see any gathering stitches or any gathers or pleats. You just want to see sort of a ruffling at the seam allowance, and then it should be flat on your easing stitches. Okay, so then you're gonna use a lot of pins there to secure the easing. And again, pull up the easing stitches from the bobbin side. So whichever side you were stitching, the thread's on the bottom. And then once you've pinned all the way around the sleeve or the armhole, then you're going to go start stitching and use the free arm of your machine and place the armhole around the free arm, starting at the underarm, and stitch at 5/8 of an inch. And anytime after you set in a sleeve, you just want to check it from the right side of the dress to make sure there aren't any little puckers or gathers. And then once you're happy with it, then you can trim your threads, trim your seam allowances. So we're going to trim these down under the armhole, and you can also finish your seam allowances as one, trimming them down to about 3/8 of an inch. All right, so this is step 16 as you're following along in your book, and we are going to stitch the top of each pleat. So it says based, but you can really use a regular stitch here. So what we're going to be doing is stitching across that horizontal upper edge. It's a little tricky because, as you can see, when you turn back the pleat, we did clip diagonally to each circle point. So there is going to be clips on the underside as we're stitching. But what you're going to do is just, form each pleat, the top, just sort of form it flat, if that makes any sense. And you're going to pin across the upper edge. And now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch across that upper horizontal edge of the pleat. So using a regular stitch and back stitching, you're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch or as close as you can without stitching over that clipped point on the underside. Because as you can see, you're going to get real close to that sort of awkward point on the underside. So just get the dress out of the way as best you can to just isolate this upper edge and continue along this horizontal upper edge of the gore. And we're just closing it up so that we're able to apply the waist stay in the next step. And then backstitch on the other end as well. And you're going to repeat that on each of your gores. Okay, so now we're going to be sewing our lap zipper. We're going to do this in 2 chapters. So first we're going to start with the underlap side, which is the right side of the dress as you're looking at the dress back. And first thing you're going to do is you're going to press in the zipper seam allowance 1/2 inch. Now you may remember that when we pressed in the seam allowances for our clean finish, that's the same amount. So 1/2 inch on the zipper and the dress, or the facing and the dress, and then 1/2 inch at the zipper seam allowance. Okay, so now that that is pressed in, it's kind of nice to get this on a raised surface, like a sleeve board, but it's not necessary. And now you're gonna grab your zipper. So you need a 24-inch standard, not invisible zipper. And you're going to place it underneath the fold that you just pressed in. And you want to align it so that the zipper teeth are just right next to the fold of fabric. And then you're going to pin parallel to the zipper teeth. And keep in mind that you're going to be stitching this from the neckline down. So it's a good idea to have the heads of your pins towards the bottom, away from the neckline. That makes them easier to pull out as you're stitching. And so you're pinning all the way down. On this side, we don't have to worry about matching anything up, so just make sure that you distribute the fabric evenly to the zipper tape, pinning from top to bottom. And now you're going to open your zipper at least halfway. Grab a zipper foot for your machine, and so that you can stitch as close up to the zipper teeth as possible. And you're stitching just right on the fold of fabric, about 1/8 of an inch or a little less away from the zipper teeth. When you get to the pull, you'll need to stop with your needle down, lift up your presser foot, and finish off that side. And that is your underlap side, and next we will move on to the overlap. Okay, so now we're ready to work on the overlap side of the zipper, or the left side as you're looking at the dress. So on this side, you're gonna press in your seam allowance 5/8 of an inch. And again, this is the same thing we did when we were doing the clean finish preparation. We pressed the dress in 5/8 of an inch, and then the facing 7/8 of an inch. So you'll be able to see what's going to happen here is that the facing is just going to clear the zipper and be folded in next to it to create a really clean, professional finish. Okay, so now we're going to pin the overlap side. So what you want to do is you want it to just cover, so take that pressed in edge, and it should just cover the line of stitching that you just did on your underlap. And then you want to pin to the left of the zipper teeth. So you're creating a little flap there with your pins, pinning about 3/8 of an inch to the left, and you're pinning through the seam allowances and the zipper tape. So being careful not to pin to your surface underneath, of course, if you're pinning on an ironing board. And then you're going to open the zipper all the way. And now move your zipper foot to the opposite side of the needle, or the needle to the opposite side of the zipper foot, whichever way your machine works. And now you're going to start stitching at the neckline. Again, your pin should be, the pointy side should be facing the neckline. And put your needle down, and you're going to be stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. So with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. This is top stitching, so it will show on your garment. So take it nice and slow. And it can be really helpful to hold the dress from the back as well to create a sort of nice flat surface as you're stitching. And pull out those pins as you go and stitch all the way down to the bottom. And again, holding this surface nice and taut and flat with both hands will help avoid getting any little puckers or folds or anything as you're stitching. Okay, so your zipper is all the way open, so stitch as close as you can to the pull, and then stop with your needle down, lift up your presser foot, and close the pull so that it's behind your presser foot. And now we're going to continue our stitching. This is a little awkward because now you don't have the marks on your machine to guide you at 3/8 of an inch. So stitch as straight as you can. You can also mark it in advance with a disappearing ink marker or chalk that brushes off. When you get to the base of that opening, the zipper opening, where the seam starts below the zipper circle, you are going to pivot. So stop with your needle down, pivot the work 90 degrees, And then you're going to stitch at a right angle, so creating a little L shape here, and backstitch. You have to be careful that you don't stitch over any metal, like the lower stop on your zipper. So just be careful about that. We're just stitching over the teeth there. And so this is your completed lap zipper. Okay, so this is step 18 in the instructions. You are just going to turn in your facings at the center back on the inside of the dress. And you're going to pin them to the zipper tape. You can also just, give them a little press here. And then you're going to pin that fold to the zipper tape. And then this is going to be hand stitched in. So this is just a little finishing work here. Pin that in place. Same thing on the opposite side. So make sure it's clearing the zipper teeth. And then you're going to hand stitch this in place. And I did want to mention too that you can also hand stitch at the shoulder seams to tack the facing in place there, and at the center front. So just to keep the facing turned to the inside of the dress so it doesn't pop out as you're wearing it or putting it on. Those are a couple places that you can secure either by hand, or the shoulder seams and center front you can do a stitch in the ditch by machine. So now you're just going to use a hand slip stitch to secure the facing to the zipper tape. Okay, so here it is, your waiststay. Now this is a very vintage technique. You're going to use a Petersham or grosgrain ribbon at your waistline, and it's going to finish that waistline beautifully on the inside of the dress, as well as control those gores. The other thing that I like about a waiststay is that it definitely cinches the dress into your waistline to really give you that Dior fit and flare look. So let's get started sewing that waiststay. Okay, so you've got your grosgrain or Petersham ribbon, and you want to cut it to your waist measurement plus 1.5 inches. And I wouldn't cut it exactly to your waist measurement. Give yourself a little bit of ease there because you don't want it to be too tight while you're wearing it. Okay, so you're going to turn in the edges of the grosgrain ribbon 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch. So you've turned in 1/2 inch total on that side. And pin in place. And then you're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Turn in 1/4 and then double it, another 1/4. Press and then pin in place. And what we're going to do is we're going to stitch these little ends down, so kind of like hemming the ends of this grosgrain ribbon, and then we're going to hand sew hooks and eyes, or hooks and bars, so that it overlaps by 1/2 inch. Okay, so we're just going to create like a little belt almost, like an inner belt, and then it will get hand stitched, or I'm sorry, it actually gets machine stitched to the inside of the dress. But this is the same process as creating a waiststay for a strapless dress, which sometimes gets hand tacked to the inside. So this is a really fun vintage skill. Also helps if you're wearing a strapless dress, helps it stay in place. For the Madeleine dress, it's really a nice finishing technique for the upper edges of those gores to give you a nice clean finish on the inside of the dress, as well as cinching it in. So we're just stitching along the fold where we turned in the short ends of the ribbon. And now you're going to form a ring and overlap the ends by 1/2 inch. And then on the underlap, you'll put your bars, so you have 2 little sets of hooks and bars. You'll put the bar side on one side, and you want them to be facing each other on the underlap. They shouldn't butt up against each other. So you do want a full 1/2 inch overlap. So place bars on one side and then hooks on the other. Okay, so on to step 20 in the book instructions. We are going to insert the waiststay into the dress. So first we want to divide the waiststay into quadrants. So you can find the center front of the waiststay by folding it in half. And there's a pin opposite from center back. Place a pin there. And now we're going to find the side seams by folding into 4s here. And then placing a pin for each side seam. So now we have a pin marked at the side seams, center front, and then of course we know where the center back is because it's the hook and bar opening. Okay, so open your dress and you're going to find the pin for center front and place it at the center front seam of the dress. And we're going to be aligning the upper edge of the grosgrain or Peter Sham to the upper edge of the Gores and pinning them in place. You're looking for the notches for the waistline, and the bottom of the grosgrain aligns with those notches on your center front seam. And so next you're going to do your match points. So I would recommend going to your side seam next. You can see Andrea doing that now. We have a pin for the side seam, which is going to match the side seam of the dress, and she's going to match that to the upper edge of the gore. And we're just going to keep pinning to the gores. The ribbon only gets pinned to the gores themselves. So make sure not to pin to the dress underneath. Just isolate the gore and place pins through the upper edge. And now when you go to the back of the dress, you'll see that the gores overlap, which is totally fine and what you are looking for. Of course, it's different in different sizes, so keep that in mind too. But if you lay them flat on this dress, you will see some overlap. And so you want to overlap them when pinning to the ribbon. And then the waiststay will be free at the center back of the dress beyond the last gore at the back princess seam. So same thing on the other side, just pin to the top of the gores, overlapping the gores as needed. And remember, the waiststay never gets pinned to the dress itself, just to the tops of the gores. And now you're going to stitch this by machine. So starting at the back gore, and you can stitch this a couple different ways. We're stitching it here about 1/4 of an inch above the lower edge of the waiststay. You could also do 2 lines of stitching, one at the very lower edge of the waist tape and one at the upper edge. Sort of edge stitching more. But in any case, you're just going to stitch the ribbon to the gores and see how there's an area between these 2 gores where you're not really stitching the ribbon to anything. You could break your stitching here if you wanted, but it's just, it's easier to just continue your stitching here. So that's totally fine. So just make sure that the dress stays out of the way and isn't getting caught in your stitching accidentally. So you can see how Andrea is pulling the dress out of the way and just stitching on the waist tape here at center front. And continue the same way on the other side until you get to that back gore. And you can trim any threads at the upper edge there behind the tape. And there is your inserted waist stay. And as you wear the dress, you're going to hook it in the back. And there it is. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to hem our sleeves. So you can put on a sleeve board like this and then just turn up the seam allowance 5/8 of an inch to the inside of the sleeve. And you're going to press all the way around. And now we're going to machine stitch this in place. So your stitching should be at about 1/2 inch. And I usually do this from the right side, but you can do it from the wrong side as Andrea's doing here. Stitching at 1/2 inch, give your sleeve a final press here. So get out any ripples or anything that you have on the hem of the sleeve. And repeat for the other sleeve. And next we'll move on to the dress hem. Okay, so now we're ready to hem our dress, and you definitely want to let this hang for 24 hours. Try it on, make sure you're happy with the hem, even it up if needed. And then once you're happy, you're going to turn the hem up 5/8 of an inch. Now, this is a little bit unusual because of the gores. So let's start at center back. You're just going to press this up 5/8 of an inch at this back section, just like we did with the sleeves. And then continue on for each gore. Now, keep in mind that after you do your hemming, you're gonna have to re-press your pleats here. See how Andrea's folding them? You just wanna turn them in and press them because we're gonna be pressing out our pleat creases as we press our hem in. But you always wanna do a final press on your skirt anyway after hemming, so just keep that in mind. So we've done all our stitching here, and one thing to note is that if you're using a contrast fabric for your gores, you're going to want to switch your thread color in between. So what we did was we hemmed in red each of the red panels, and then all at once, and then switched to white thread to do each of the polka dot gores individually. And that is it. Your dress is totally finished. Okay, everyone, that is it, your finished Madeleine dress. I hope you've loved sewing along with us today. I personally am so excited to have my own contrast gore version. I was so jealous of Susie's amazing version that we made for her in the book, the turquoise and white polka dots. So I'm very excited to have my own red and white version now. And I can't wait to see what you make with this pattern. So please do share your makes. You can tag me on Instagram at Gertie18 and use the hashtags Madeleine Dress and Charmed Sewing Studio. And don't forget that below you will find the links to the other videos for the book patterns, which are the Camille sheath and the Lillian dress. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.